the frozen wasteland of Siberia, where temperatures drop to -40 degrees and visibility becomes zero during blizzards, a woman who was declared dead 3 years ago walks through a heavily guarded military compound. Her footsteps are silent in the deep snow, her breath creates no visible vapor in the frigid air, and the motion sensors that should detect any human presence remain completely still. The guards at their posts see nothing but endless white, unaware that someone who mastered the art of becoming invisible is now standing just 10 feet away from them. This is not a ghost story. This is not fiction. This is the true account of Elena Volkov, a former Soviet intelligence operative who spent 3 years learning to survive in conditions that would kill most people within hours. She was presumed dead after a mission went wrong, but she had actually discovered something that would change the course of an entire conflict. Now, she has returned to infiltrate the very base where her former colleagues believe her body lies buried under tons of ice and snow. What they don't know is that Elena has been watching them, studying their routines and preparing for this moment when she would walk back into their lives like a specter from their past. But she's not here for revenge. She's here because she learned something during those 3 years in the wilderness that could prevent a war, and the only way to deliver that information is to break into the most secure facility in the region while a blizzard rages outside. The question isn't whether she can get inside. The question is whether anyone will believe what she has to say when they see a dead woman walking through their halls. The wind howled across the Siberian landscape like a wounded animal, carrying snow so thick that Elena Volkov could barely see her own hands extended in front of her face. She pressed her body against the concrete wall of the perimeter fence, feeling the cold seep through the layers of clothing she had carefully crafted from materials scavenged over 3 long years of survival. The temperature gauge on her makeshift equipment read -30 at 8 degrees Celsius. But Elena had long ago stopped feeling the cold in the same way other people did. 3 years ago, she had been Agent Volkov, one of the Soviet Union's most skilled intelligence operatives. She had been sent on what was supposed to be a routine surveillance mission to this very base, tasked with gathering information about weapons development projects that Western intelligence suspected were taking place in this remote facility. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong when an unexpected avalanche buried the extraction point, cutting off her escape route and leaving her stranded in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Her handlers had waited exactly 72 hours before declaring her missing and presumed dead. Standard protocol dictated that no rescue attempt would be made in such extreme conditions, especially when the avalanche had made the area completely inaccessible for months. Elena Volkov had simply vanished from all official records, another casualty of the dangerous game played between superpowers in remote corners of the world. But Elena had not died in that avalanche. She had survived by doing something that went against every instinct of her training. Instead of trying to reach civilization, she had gone deeper into the wilderness. She had learned to hunt with primitive weapons, to build shelters that could withstand temperatures that would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. And most importantly, she had discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about the conflict she had been sent to investigate. During her years of survival, Elena had stumbled upon a network of caves that housed evidence of a secret agreement between supposed enemies. Documents and equipment hidden in those caves revealed that the weapons being developed at the base were not intended for use against Western nations as intelligence agencies believed. Instead, they were being prepared for a false flag operation that would justify military action against civilian populations in several countries that had strategic resources both sides wanted to control. The magnitude of what she had discovered was staggering. Thousands of innocent people would die, entire regions would be destabilized, and a conflict that could escalate beyond anyone's control would be triggered by carefully orchestrated deception. Elena had spent months in those caves, photographing documents with improvised equipment and memorizing details that could expose the conspiracy. But she faced an impossible problem. She had no way to contact anyone who could act on this information, and even if she could reach the outside world, who would believe a woman who had been declared dead 3 years ago? The solution had come to her gradually as she observed the base from hidden positions during her hunting expeditions. She had noticed that security protocols had changed significantly since her supposed death. New personnel had been rotated in, but the facility's basic layout remained the same. More importantly, she had identified weaknesses in their current security measures that could be exploited during severe weather conditions, when visibility was near zero and electronic surveillance systems were impaired by electromagnetic interference from the storms. Elena had spent 6 months preparing for this infiltration. She had fashioned tools from scavenged materials, created false identification documents using techniques she remembered from her training, and most critically, She had conditioned her body to operate in conditions that would incapacitate most people within minutes. She had practiced moving silently through deep snow, controlling her breathing to minimize visible vapor, and timing her movements to avoid detection by the rotating patrols she had observed during dozens of reconnaissance trips. Now, as she crouched against the perimeter wall with the blizzard providing perfect cover, Elena felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that she had not experienced since her first covert operations years ago. She was about to walk back into a world that had forgotten her existence, carrying information that could prevent a catastrophe, but which also made her incredibly dangerous to powerful people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The base sprawled before her like a small city carved from concrete and steel. Despite the blizzard, she could see the dim outlines of buildings through the snow, their windows glowing with warm light that seemed impossibly distant from her position in the frozen darkness. Guard towers rose from the compound at regular intervals, their searchlights sweeping back and forth in predetermined patterns that Elena had memorized during weeks of observation. Between the towers, she could make out the shapes of patrol vehicles moving slowly along cleared paths, their headlights barely penetrating the wall of snow that surrounded the facility. Elena checked the crude timepiece she had constructed from salvaged parts. The patrol schedule indicated that she had a window of approximately 8 minutes before the next security sweep would pass through the section of fence she had chosen for entry. She had identified this particular location because it was positioned between two guard towers at a distance that created a blind spot when visibility was reduced by weather conditions. During clear weather, this approach would have been suicide, but the blizzard had turned the base's normally impenetrable defenses into something she could navigate. Moving with practiced silence, Elena approached the chain-link fence that surrounded the perimeter. The fence was topped with razor wire and equipped with motion sensors, but she had observed that the sensors were frequently triggered by wind-blown debris during storms, causing false alarms that the guards had learned to ignore. She had also noticed that the electrical current running through the fence was periodically interrupted by ice accumulation on the insulators, creating brief windows when the barrier could be safely breached. Using a tool she had crafted from metal salvaged from a crashed aircraft she had found during her years in the wilderness, Elena carefully probed the fence until she located a section where ice had formed around the electrical connections. She worked quickly but methodically, using the metal tool to create a gap large enough for her to squeeze through while avoiding contact with any part of the fence that might still be carrying current. The wind masked any small sounds she made, and the thick snowfall concealed her movements from the distant guard towers. Once through the fence, Elena found herself in a narrow strip of open ground that separated the perimeter from the first line of buildings. This area was regularly patrolled, but the patrols moved in vehicles during severe weather, sticking to cleared paths that she could easily avoid. She had studied the base layout during her original mission 3 years ago, and while some details had certainly changed, the basic geography remained the same. Her destination was a communications building located near the center of the compound, where she hoped to access equipment that would allow her to transmit the evidence she had gathered to contacts who could act on the information. Elena moved across the open ground in short dashes, timing her movements to coincide with the strongest gusts of wind when visibility dropped to almost zero. Between movements, she pressed herself against whatever cover was available, using techniques she had perfected during her survival training to minimize her heat signature and remain invisible to thermal imaging equipment. The snow continued to fall heavily, accumulating on her clothing and helping her blend into the white landscape that surrounded the base. As she approached the first building, Elena could see warm light spilling from windows and hear the distant hum of machinery that kept the facility operational even in these extreme conditions. The contrast between the harsh environment outside and the comfortable conditions within the base was striking, but it also represented the disconnect between those who made decisions about war and peace and those who suffered the consequences of those decisions. Elena had spent 3 years learning what it meant to struggle for basic survival while powerful people played games with human lives, and that experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on the mission she was now undertaking. The communications building was still several hundred meters away, requiring her to navigate between multiple structures while avoiding patrol routes and surveillance cameras. Elena had memorized the locations of external cameras during her reconnaissance, but she knew that new equipment might have been installed since her last observation. She would have to rely on her training and instincts to detect and avoid any security measures she had not anticipated. Moving between buildings required patience and careful timing. Elena would identify her next position of cover, observe the area for several minutes to detect any patrol patterns or surveillance activity, then move quickly and silently to the new location. Each movement brought her deeper into the heart of the base, closer to areas where security would be more intense and the consequences of detection would be more severe. As she crept along the side of a maintenance building, Elena caught her first glimpse of personnel moving within the base. Through a window, she could see technicians working at computer terminals, their faces illuminated by the glow of screens displaying data she could not read from her position. These were people who had no knowledge of the conspiracy she had discovered, ordinary individuals doing their jobs while remaining unaware that their work was being used to support an operation that could trigger a devastating conflict. Elena felt a familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. During her years in the wilderness, she had sometimes wondered if the information she had discovered was worth the risk of attempting to expose it. Now, seeing the faces of people who would be affected by the consequences of that conspiracy, she knew that she had no choice but to continue with her mission, regardless of the personal danger involved. The snow continued to fall as Elena made her way deeper into the base, each step taking her further from any possibility of retreat and closer to a confrontation with the past that had shaped her into someone completely different from the agent who had disappeared 3 years ago. She was no longer fighting for ideology or national interests. She was fighting to prevent a catastrophe that would destroy innocent lives. And that motivation gave her a clarity of purpose that made the impossible seem achievable. Behind her, the blizzard continued to rage, erasing any trace of her passage and ensuring that her infiltration would remain undetected for as long as the weather continued to provide cover. Ahead of her lay the communications building, and the opportunity to transmit information that could change the course of history if she could reach it without being discovered by people who had every reason to believe that Elena Volkov was dead and buried somewhere in the frozen wasteland that surrounded their secure facility. Elena pressed her back against the cold concrete wall of the communications building, her heart pounding as she listened to the sound of approaching footsteps crunching through the snow. The patrol she had been tracking was running behind schedule, probably slowed down by the worsening weather conditions, but their unexpected timing had nearly caught her exposed in the open courtyard between buildings. She controlled her breathing, drawing on techniques learned during survival training to remain calm while adrenaline coursed through her system. The footsteps passed within 3 meters of her position, but the guards were focused on completing their rounds as quickly as possible in the brutal conditions rather than conducting a thorough search for intruders. Elena waited until the sound of their movement faded completely before examining the entrance to the communications building. The door was secured with both an electronic lock and a traditional mechanical backup, standard procedure for sensitive facilities that needed to remain operational during power failures. During her original mission 3 years ago, Elena had studied the base's security protocols extensively. Electronic locks could be bypassed with the right equipment, but she had no access to specialized tools that would be required for such a sophisticated system. However, she remembered that maintenance personnel often used service entrances that were secured with less advanced systems, prioritizing accessibility for emergency repairs over maximum security. The communications building would need regular maintenance to keep critical equipment operational in the harsh climate, which meant there had to be alternative access points. Elena circled the building carefully, staying in the shadows cast by external equipment and using the ongoing blizzard to mask her movements. On the building's eastern side, she found what she was looking for: a service entrance marked with warning signs about electrical hazards and authorized personnel only. The door was secured with a mechanical lock that could be defeated using techniques she had learned during specialized training for situations where electronic methods were unavailable. Working by feel in the near-total darkness, Elena used tools she had crafted during her years of survival to manipulate the lock mechanism. The process required patience and delicate touch, as any mistake could trigger an alarm system or damage the lock in a way that would alert security personnel to her presence. The metal tools were painfully cold against her bare fingers, but she had long ago learned to work through physical discomfort when mission requirements demanded it. After several tense minutes, Elena felt the lock mechanism give way. She opened the door just wide enough to slip inside, then closed it carefully behind her, ensuring that no snow or cold air would enter the building in a way that might alert personnel to the breach. The interior of the building was dramatically warmer than the outside environment, and Elena had to resist the temptation to simply stand still and allow her body to absorb the comfortable temperature. The service entrance opened into a maintenance corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits that carried power and data throughout the facility. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination, casting long shadows that offered concealment as Elena moved deeper into the building. She could hear the hum of electronic equipment operating somewhere ahead, along with the distant sound of voices engaged in what sounded like routine conversation rather than any kind of security alert. Elena's destination was the main communications center, where high-powered transmission equipment would allow her to send the evidence she had gathered to contacts who could act on the information. However, reaching that area would require her to navigate through sections of the building that were likely occupied by personnel who would immediately recognize that she did not belong in the facility. She needed to find a way to access the transmission equipment without alerting anyone to her presence. Moving through the maintenance corridors, Elena began to piece together the current layout of the building based on sounds and visual cues. The facility was larger than she remembered, suggesting that significant expansion had taken place during the 3 years since her presumed death. New equipment had been installed, and she could hear multiple conversations taking place in different areas of the building, indicating that the staff had been increased substantially. As she approached what she believed to be the main communications area, Elena encountered her first major obstacle. The maintenance corridor ended at a security checkpoint where personnel would need to present identification before proceeding to sensitive areas. The checkpoint was automated, with card readers and biometric scanners that would immediately detect any attempt at unauthorized access. Even if she could somehow bypass the electronic systems, the checkpoint was positioned in a way that made it impossible to proceed without being recorded by multiple surveillance cameras. Elena retreated to a junction in the maintenance corridor and considered her options. Direct access through the security checkpoint was impossible without proper credentials, but there might be alternative routes that would allow her to reach the communications equipment. During her original mission, she had learned that many secure facilities included emergency access routes that could be used by maintenance personnel during crisis situations when normal security protocols might prevent necessary repairs. Studying the layout of pipes and electrical systems visible in the maintenance area, Elena began to trace pathways that might lead to her destination. Climate control systems would need to reach every area of the building, including the communications center, and the large ducts required for heating and ventilation might provide an alternative route. However, using ventilation systems for infiltration was extremely dangerous, as most modern facilities included sensors that would detect unauthorized movement within the ducts. Elena located an access panel that provided entry to the building's ventilation system. The panel was secured with basic fasteners rather than sophisticated locks, suggesting that it was intended for routine maintenance rather than security purposes. She carefully removed the fasteners using improvised tools, working slowly to avoid making noise that might alert personnel in adjacent areas. The ventilation duct was larger than she had expected, allowing her to crawl through the system while maintaining reasonable mobility. However, the metal surfaces were ice-cold despite the building's heating system, and she had to move carefully to avoid creating noise that would be audible to people in other parts of the facility. The duct system was also completely dark, forcing her to navigate by feel while following what she hoped was the correct path toward the communications center. As she moved through the ventilation system, Elena could hear conversations taking place in rooms beneath her. The voices were muffled by the metal ducts and building materials, but she could occasionally make out words and phrases that provided information about current activities within the facility. Most of the conversation seemed to involve routine technical discussions about equipment maintenance and operational procedures, but she also heard references to schedules and deadlines that suggested significant activity was planned for the near future. After what felt like an eternity of careful movement through the confined space, Elena reached a junction where multiple ducts converged. Air was being drawn through the system by powerful fans, and she could feel the temperature fluctuations that indicated she was near areas with high-powered electronic equipment. The communications center would generate substantial heat that would require dedicated cooling systems, and Elena hoped that following the air circulation patterns would lead her to her destination. A faint glow ahead indicated that she was approaching a ventilation grate that opened into an occupied area. Elena moved forward cautiously, until she could see through the grate into what appeared to be the main communications room. The space was filled with sophisticated transmission equipment, computer terminals, and displays showing data streams that she could not interpret from her position. More importantly, the room appeared to be unoccupied at the moment, though she could see that workstations showed signs of recent use. Elena studied the ventilation grate carefully, looking for the best way to remove it without causing damage that would alert security personnel to her presence. The grate was secured with standard screws that could be removed using tools she carried, but the process would need to be completed quickly once she began, as any extended period of unusual activity would likely be detected by surveillance systems. Working as quietly as possible, Elena began removing the screws that held the ventilation grate in place. Each screw had to be turned slowly to avoid creating noise, and she had to catch each one as it came free to prevent them from falling into the room below. The process was nerve-wracking, as she expected to hear voices or footsteps that would indicate personnel were approaching the communications center. With the grate finally removed, Elena lowered herself carefully into the communications room. The space was larger than it had appeared from above, with multiple workstations arranged around sophisticated equipment that hummed quietly as it processed data streams from various sources. Banks of monitors displayed information in languages and technical formats that would require time to interpret. But Elena could see that at least some of the equipment was designed for long-range transmission to multiple destinations. Elena quickly located the transmission equipment that would allow her to send the evidence she had gathered to contacts who could act on the information. However, operating the equipment would require her to power up systems that might alert security personnel to unauthorized activity in the communications center. She would need to work quickly and efficiently to upload and transmit the data before anyone could respond to potential security alerts. As she began the process of activating the transmission equipment, Elena heard footsteps approaching in the corridor outside the communications room. She froze, listening carefully to determine whether the person was simply passing by or intended to enter the area where she was working. The footsteps slowed and stopped directly outside the room, followed by the sound of someone manipulating an electronic lock. Elena looked around quickly for concealment options within the communications room. The equipment racks provided some cover, but anyone entering the room would likely notice signs of recent activity, including the removed ventilation grate and the activated transmission systems. She would need to find a way to complete her mission while remaining undetected by whoever was about to enter the room, a challenge that would require every skill she had developed during her years of survival and covert operations. The door handle turned slowly as Elena pressed herself into the shadows behind a bank of equipment, clutching the evidence that could prevent a war while preparing for the confrontation that might determine whether that evidence would ever reach the people who needed to see it. Outside the building, the blizzard continued to rage, but Elena knew that the real storm was about to begin inside the communications center where she had finally reached the heart of the conspiracy she had discovered in the frozen wilderness. The door to the communications room opened slowly, and Elena held her breath as she watched from her concealed position behind the equipment rack. A middle-aged man in a military uniform stepped into the room, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and moving with the casual demeanor of someone following a routine check rather than responding to a security alert. Elena recognized him immediately, despite the 3 years that had passed since she had last seen his face. Colonel Dmitry Kozlov had been her handler during the original mission, the man who had sent her to investigate this very facility and who had ultimately declared her dead when she failed to return from the avalanche. Kozlov approached one of the workstations and began reviewing displays showing data streams from various monitoring systems. Elena watched as he scrolled through information that appeared to be routine operational reports, his movements suggesting that this was a regular inspection rather than any kind of emergency response. However, his presence in the communications center created a significant complication for Elena's mission. She needed access to the transmission equipment to send the evidence she had gathered, but Kozlov's familiarity with the systems meant that he would immediately notice any unauthorized activity. As Elena considered her options, she noticed that Kozlov appeared tired and distracted. His movements were slower than she remembered, and he seemed to be going through the motions of his inspection without paying close attention to details. The coffee cup in his hand suggested that he was working late shifts, possibly indicating that the facility was operating under increased operational tempo, in preparation for the conspiracy Elena had discovered. Elena realized that she was facing a choice that would define not only the success of her mission but also her own survival. She could wait for Kozlov to complete his inspection and leave the room, hoping that she would have enough time to complete the data transmission before anyone else arrived. Alternatively, she could reveal herself to her former handler and attempt to convince him that the evidence she had gathered was genuine and worthy of action. The first option was safer, but might not provide enough time to complete her mission. The second option was extremely risky but could potentially create an ally who had the authority and resources to act on the information immediately. The decision was made for her when Kozlov turned toward the equipment rack where Elena was hiding. Something had caught his attention, possibly the removed ventilation grate or some other sign of her presence in the room. Elena watched as his expression changed from routine boredom to alert suspicion, and she knew that her concealment was about to be discovered. Elena stepped out from behind the equipment rack, her hands visible and empty to demonstrate that she was not carrying weapons. Kozlov's reaction was exactly what she had expected.
The coffee cup fell from his hand, shattering on the floor as he stared at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief that suggested he was seeing a ghost rather than a living person.
"Hello, Dmitry," Elena said quietly, using his first name to emphasize their previous working relationship and to demonstrate that she remembered details from their past interactions.
"I know this is unexpected, but I need you to listen to what I have to say before you call security or take any other action." Kozlov's hand moved instinctively toward the communication device on his belt, but he stopped the motion as he continued to stare at Elena. His training told him to immediately alert security to the presence of an unauthorized intruder, but his recognition of Elena created confusion about how to categorize the situation. "That's impossible," Kozlov whispered. his voice barely audible above the hum of electronic equipment. "You're dead. We received confirmation that you were killed in the avalanche. There was no way anyone could have survived in those conditions." Elena had anticipated this reaction and was prepared to provide proof of her identity and survival. During her years in the wilderness, she had often imagined this conversation and had planned how to convince people that she was genuine rather than some kind of imposter attempting to infiltrate the facility. She began recounting details from their previous working relationship that only the real Elena Volkov would know, including private conversations they had shared and operational details that were not included in any official records. As Elena spoke, Kozlov's expression gradually shifted from disbelief to growing recognition. The details she provided were too specific and personal to be the result of interrogation or intelligence gathering by hostile forces. Only Elena could know about the conversation they had shared the night before her mission, when she had expressed concerns about the political implications of their work, and he had assured her that their efforts served a larger purpose than the immediate objectives of individual operations. "Even if you are Elena," Kozlov said slowly, "your presence here is unauthorized and potentially compromises the security of this facility. I have obligations that require me to report this incident immediately, regardless of our previous working relationship." Elena had expected this response and was prepared to present the evidence that had motivated her dangerous infiltration of the base. She reached carefully into her clothing and removed a waterproof container that held photographs and documents she had discovered during her years in the wilderness. The container had been crafted from materials she had scavenged, but it had effectively protected the evidence through months of harsh weather and difficult travel. "Before you make that report," Elena said, "you need to see what I discovered. The reason I'm here isn't personal survival or revenge. I found evidence of an operation that will cost thousands of innocent lives and potentially trigger a conflict that could escalate beyond anyone's control." Elena opened the container and spread the documents on a nearby workstation, arranging them so that Kozlov could see the most damaging evidence immediately. The photographs showed weapons systems and technical specifications that Kozlov would recognize, but they also included communication records and operational plans that revealed the true purpose of the facility's activities. Kozlov approached the workstation cautiously, as if the documents might represent some kind of trap or deception. However, as he began reading the material Elena had gathered, his expression changed from suspicion to growing concern, and finally to what appeared to be genuine alarm. The documents Elena had discovered provided details about false flag operations and coordinated deception campaigns that went far beyond anything Kozlov had been told about the facility's mission. "Where did you get this?" Kozlov asked, his voice tight with tension as he continued examining the evidence. "These documents are classified at levels that should make them inaccessible to field operatives, and some of this information appears to involve operations that I was never briefed about." Elena explained her discovery of the cave network and the hidden cache of documents that had been stored there for reasons she could only speculate about. Someone with access to the highest levels of the conspiracy had apparently been maintaining backup records, possibly as insurance against betrayal by their co-conspirators. The location had been chosen for its remoteness and the extreme conditions that would discourage investigation. But Elena's survival situation had led her to explore areas that would normally never be examined. As Elena described her years of survival and investigation, Kozlov's attention remained focused on the documents spread before him. She could see him connecting pieces of information and beginning to understand the implications of what she had discovered. His training and experience gave him context for interpreting the evidence that Elena had gathered, and that background was making him realize the magnitude of the conspiracy they were both looking at. "If this information is accurate," Kozlov said quietly, "then everything I've been told about our mission here is either incomplete or deliberately false. The operations we're supporting aren't designed to enhance national security. They're intended to create justification for military actions that serve private interests rather than any legitimate government policy." Elena nodded, relieved that Kozlov was beginning to understand the significance of what she had discovered. However, understanding the problem was only the first step toward solving it. They needed to find a way to expose the conspiracy to people who had the authority and motivation to take action, and that process would require resources and contacts that Elena did not have access to after 3 years of isolation. "The question now is what we do with this information," Elena said. "I came here because this facility has communication equipment that can reach contacts who might be able to act on what we've discovered. But I need help operating the systems and identifying recipients who aren't part of the conspiracy themselves." Kozlov was quiet for several minutes as he continued reviewing the documents Elena had provided. She could see him weighing options and considering the consequences of different courses of action. His decision would determine not only whether the conspiracy could be exposed, but also whether Elena would survive her return from the dead. There are people I can contact, Kozlov said finally, but transmitting this information through official channels would alert the same people who are implementing the conspiracy. We need to find a way to get this evidence to individuals who have the independence and authority to act without going through compromised communication networks. Elena and Kozlov spent the next several hours working together to identify potential recipients for the evidence and to prepare secure transmission methods that would minimize the risk of interception by hostile forces. The process required them to use their combined knowledge of intelligence networks and communication protocols to create a plan that would maximize the chances of the information reaching people who could act on it effectively. As dawn approached, they had successfully transmitted copies of Elena's evidence to multiple contacts in different organizations and countries. The recipients included journalists, government officials, and intelligence operatives who had reputations for independence and integrity. Elena's discovery would soon be evaluated by people who had the resources and motivation to investigate the conspiracy and take appropriate action. The blizzard that had provided cover for Elena's infiltration was beginning to weaken as the transmission process was completed. Soon, normal security procedures would resume, and Elena's presence in the facility would become much more difficult to conceal. However, her mission was now complete, and the evidence that could prevent a catastrophic conflict had been delivered to people who could act on it. Kozlov helped Elena prepare for her departure from the base, providing her with supplies and equipment that would improve her chances of survival during the journey back to civilization. He also arranged for extraction support that would meet her at a location outside the base's security perimeter, ending her 3-year isolation in the wilderness. As Elena prepared to leave the communications room, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from presumed death to successful completion of a mission that could change the course of history. Her survival in impossible conditions had been motivated by the knowledge that innocent lives depended on her ability to expose a conspiracy that threatened to trigger devastating conflict. Now that information was in the hands of people who could prevent the catastrophe she had discovered. The woman who walked out of the base into the early morning light was fundamentally different from the agent who had disappeared in an avalanche 3 years earlier. Elena Volkov had learned that survival was about more than staying alive in harsh conditions. It was about maintaining the determination to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible, and when the personal cost of action might be greater than the price of surrender.